Welcome to Environmental Health Trust Patreon webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the FCC's reply brief.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Deborah Davis, and I'm delighted to be with you for this quick update on this 87-page brief that the FCC has just filed in response to our critical lawsuit. In its response, the FCC basically confirms that it feels that there's nothing new in science in the past 24 years. Kind of amazing considering what other countries have done. The United States seems to be determined to go it alone and ignore what other high-tech countries have pointed out. In particular, the FCC denies that there are any non-thermal effects of radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic fields. They make that denial in the face of growing evidence on the damaging effects on sperm, which I've talked about here and in my TEDx talk as well. And they also totally reject the need to protect those who are electrosensitive, arguing that these, quote, allegedly sensitive individuals do not require special protection, which flies in the face, again, of what many localities in this country have done and what many countries are moving to do, to recognize that there are individuals who do suffer greatly from their exposures. In addition to rejecting completely the relevance of the Americans for Disabilities Act, without really much argument at all, it asserts over and over again, quote, the limits, the information developed since it has adopted the limits has not changed the scientific consensus that the limits remain safe and adequate to protect public health. That is not correct. That does not reflect the latest scientific understanding of more than 400 scientists who have petitioned the United Nations on this issue. And it refers to earlier court decisions and earlier findings of the courts based in 2003, 1997, 2013, 2009. It's relying on outdated scientific information to justify the action that it's taking in 2020. I find this would be incredible. What if NASA decided they were going to fly the space shuttle with information based on 20-year-old science? People would be standing in the streets arguing that they cannot do this. They further say that they do not need to review the relevance of the NEPA Act because it does not provide a seriously different picture of the environmental landscape right now. And again, that is arguing that there's been very little change in the world since 1996 when these standards were first developed. And as to the legality of those, we have outstanding attorneys working with us who we're sure are going to make those arguments. But they also disclose some things in this reply that I think are quite interesting. On page 68, they say that they, quote, reasonably declined to propose a requirement that cell phones be tested with no separation from the body. They say that. What do they base it on? They base it on the misleading statement that phones are already tested directly next to the head. They are not. They are not. Phones are tested with a big, empty bowling ball head of a 220-pound guy weighing approximately 12 pounds. And there's a pinna distance, that's a fancy name for the ear. And that distance has varied between 10 millimeters to 5 millimeters, but it's a distance. Now, why is that distance important? First of all, any of you like me who've reached a certain age of distinction have difficulty hearing generally, and people tend to put the phone smack against their head as hard as they can to hear, sometimes not realizing that the speakers come out of the bottom of the phone, for example, and holding it here isn't going to help you. You want to actually hold it with a speakerphone and actually not hold it, but have it away from you and only use it when it's absolutely necessary. So they argue that because phones are tested against the head, and they're not, Therefore, the testing is realistic. They further argue that it should continue to be legal, which it is now, to test radiation from the phone an inch off the body, as though the phone was being held in a holster. Let me know the last time you've seen people keeping their phones in holsters. But in this brief, they also say that sometimes they call for less separation than 2.5 centimeters. Quote, for example, phone hotspot mode, I'll explain that in a moment, are tested at a maximum separation distance from the body of 1 centimeter. Well, hotspot mode, now, do you know what that is? The hotspot mode refers to the fact that your phone can serve as a hotspot for somebody else to go and receive or send wireless messages. And you may not know when your phone is being used in that way, depending on what passwords and things you've put into your system, or whether it's an automatic hotspot. And a hotspot means what it says. It is, in fact, hotter. It does bring in more radiation. And for that reason, the FCC, in its wisdom, does require a 1 centimeter distance. So you have to ask yourself, if you need 1 centimeter distance for a hotspot, why wouldn't you need it all the time, since all of these phones are programmed so they go to max power when they need to. And among the times that they need to is whenever a signal is 1 bar or 2 bars, they're weak, they have to go to max power. That means the maximum radiation is being emitted. And if a phone is next to your body or in your pocket, it is going to exceed those exposure guidelines substantially. And that is not just a theoretical argument. In 2010, when I wrote my book, Disconnect, I said that if phones were tested the way they were used, they would be found to be illegal. And by that I meant, if phones were tested in the pocket or close to the body, they would be exceeding the radiation limits that have been set. Now, in the last year, the Chicago Tribune paid for independent testing to confirm this. The year before, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, a public funded system in Canada, showed the same thing, namely that when phones are tested directly next to the body in the pocket, they exceed the current limits, which were set to avoid heating only. So we now know that the phones are set so that they can be hotspots. And we also know that they're not tested directly next to the head or body, contrary to what they say. Further, they have the gall to assert that because the head, the whole head of this large adult absorbs more radiation than the whole head of a child, therefore, this big head protects the child. This isn't about the head. This is about the brain, the developing brain of the child, which, because the child's skull is thinner, because the brain has more fluid, the child's brain is growing much faster, even if the radiation were identical, and it's not. The child's brain will absorb more radiation. And this fact has been uttered by the World Health Organization. It has been declared by the scientists who do research for Orange, the leading telecom researcher in France, and many other researchers, including a team of researchers that Environmental Health Trust works with in Brazil, with Claudio Fernandes and Alvaro de Salas, have all shown the same thing, which is that the bone marrow of a child's head can absorb 10 times more radiation than that of an adult. The bone marrow. And bone marrow, of course, is responsible for making blood. In addition, parts of the brain critical to thinking and impulse control, like the hippocampus, are getting extra exposure as well with the young developing brain. So the FCC says the, quote, the mannequin, meaning this big guy brain, we call him standard anthropomorphic mannequin, or SAM for short. The mannequin, they say, tends to overestimate exposure of the heads for most adults and children because it's designed based on the dimension of large heads. Of course it is, but we're not concerned about the head. We're concerned about the brain and specific parts in it. And this is ludicrous. And whoever advised these attorneys didn't understand basic biology, but that's not surprising because right now it's my understanding that the FCC employs almost no people with expertise in bioelectromagnetics. It's training people on the job. but they lost one of their most talented long-term employees who had worked in this field. And right now, their understanding of biology, as is evidenced by the statement they make about the head, is actually pitiful. They argue further that it's okay to use this empty bowling ball because it's standing in for all the different parts of the brain, some of which are very dense, some of which are very fluid. And it includes, by the way, this thing called the eye, which has no cooling mechanism. And right now, there are a number of other devices that are also approved to be placed right on the forehead, right close to the eye of young children that can emit levels of radiation that we know do induce heat. And that is another issue that they refuse to protect. And they do recognize that there was debate, but they say that they decided that the debate is not important enough to drive them to make any change in protecting children. This is despite the growing evidence, as in the movie on Netflix that I have to recommend you watch, Wired, called Social Dilemma, where the inventors of this technology that we are all now so captured by talk about the ways that they recognize that the design of the technology has been to addict children in particular, and the people who were designers themselves about several years ago, many of them had epiphanies when they realized they couldn't put it down, that they had become trapped to the technology that they had themselves built.
It's a commonly understood in environmental health that children are more vulnerable, but children are not little adults. You don't just scale down exposures and say, well, now it's safe for children because a child weighs half an adult, so we cut the toxic exposure in half, because their bodies and brains are still developing. And when you have fast growing cells, and especially the brain, there can be very serious impacts that happen and also are not even known until later in life for various exposures. So,
one example that we're seeing now is growing numbers of very young children who are acquiring eyeglasses. And many ophthalmologists and pediatricians are quite concerned that although it can be very convenient to distract a young child with a small screen, this is actually shortening their focal length and inducing myopia and other vision problems much earlier in life than we would have seen them. So that the issue before the court is, does the FCC adequately protect public health? And we think the answer is pretty clear. The answer is no. But ironically, in this reply brief, which I find beyond chutzpah, the FCC on page 17 of 87 says, moreover, no commenter has proposed any changes to existing protections that were supported or justified by scientifically rigorous data or analysis. In other words, we commenters, of which Environmental Health Trust has been a commenter for a decade or more, and many of the people joining in this suit, Children's Health Defense as well, have been involved in this for a long time. We are now being tasked with having not come up with an alternative for them. That's not my job. That's not my job to come up with an alternative. My job is to say, what you have now does not work. The Chicago Tribune shows it. There are lawsuits now on behalf of many people who are suffering from brain cancer or other issues relating to their cell phone use. And these are all based on new science, which the agency has refused to recognize. When last year, with no further comment, they had opened a record in 2013, and at the end of 2019, just before the Christmas holiday, they slipped out this notice that they're closing the record. That's it. The record's closed. Now, under the Administrative Procedure Act, agencies are responsible to go through records and show a rational basis of doing so. In this reply brief, they show just the opposite. They do not address any of the specific comments that have been made by many of the scientists who've done research in this field. And they conclude, quote, the weight of scientific and health evidence, particularly in the judgment of federal agencies expert in health matters, demonstrated that no changes were warranted. Well, let me tell you a little secret. The so-called federal health agencies have been hamstrung, handicapped, and really prevented from engaging in this issue. Scientists retired from the government now, like Professor Ronald Melnick, who has done an excellent job of explaining this, have gone into great detail about why the National Toxicology Program study is so important to this case. And by the way, the FCC dismisses it with the back of the hand with no more explanation than it offered in the first place. There is no substantial analysis of the NTP study, except to quote one of the scientists who said it wasn't relevant to humans. Well, that one scientist happens to be wrong, because the methods used by the National Toxicology Program are the methods that have been used to test pharmacology, toxicology, toxic substances, and radiation for more than 40 years. I was involved in helping to set up the National Toxicology Program in the 1980s. And what happened with that program early on was a recognition that we test animals in order to predict effects in humans so as to allow regulatory agencies to reduce exposure, prevent exposure, or sometimes limit it altogether. Let me give you an example. The National Toxicology Program has studied arsenic and asbestos. Those are two very important environmental carcinogens. Neither one of them causes genetic damage, by the way. We cannot find evidence of direct genetic damage, but they both are carcinogens. Why do we know that? Because we have human beings with statistically significant evidence of tumors. So now here's the thing that the FCC fails to take into account. Every agent that we know causes cancer in people will produce it in animals when adequately studied. That's why we test animals, not to prove that whether or not people have cancer from animals, but in order to prevent, in order to develop policies to protect public health and the environment. And that is where we are right now. The agency has relied not on a systematic review, not on an analysis of the thousands of submissions it received from 2013 to 2019, and prior to that, to thousands others that were submitted by other groups who've been working on this for a long, long time, such as the people from New England who have tried nobly to make the case about antennas and radiation for years. We have, at this point, evidence that there is effects, and what the agency has failed to do is to establish a record of rational review. Normally, what agencies do is hire contractors to review the submitted information. That's what they do. They didn't do that. They didn't bother. And not only that, they changed the coding for the database that was receiving all of this. And as a consequence of that, nobody at the agency actually knew what was in the record. We could show that, actually, and we will show that there is a failure to look adequately at the submitted information. And as a consequence, the FCC is really, I think, flying blind, just as the senator pointed out some time ago. They completely blow out of the water the need to look at the National Environmental Protection Act. They completely reject it. Again, how you can assert that a 21st century technology that doesn't even exist fully yet, like 5G, is going to be safe when you test it with 20th century standards, I find that hard for any rational person to accept.
The FCC is relying on the FDA as they say that the FDA says there's no reason to change limits, and they put forward that the statements that are online in a letter from the FDA, and then say, well, later the FDA came out with a report. Well, if we were afforded the opportunity to look at that report, which we were a few weeks ago when it finally came out after the FCC determination, it is a literature review that dismisses and downplays the studies that find effects. We don't know who wrote it, what scientists were involved, and we have a whole press release on Environmental Health Trust. It's now on our YouTube channel that you can watch, where we call for the FDA to retract that report because for many problems with that report. But the most important thing about it, even if you thought that it was true, is that it's only about cancer. It doesn't talk about impacts to brain, impacts to reproduction, and it certainly does not talk about impacts to bees, trees, birds, insects, or the environmental effects of which the FCC record was filled with but completely ignored. So the FCC is not being accountable to protecting the environment.
Let's talk about just one example on the insects. Recently, engineers with the Swiss National Institute that evaluates and makes the models, actually, that the FDA uses to estimate exposure into the virtual family, that team also did a three-dimensional model of a honeybee. And they showed that with exposure to what the 5G beams would be, the honeybee would resonate, would absorb more radiation than seemed advisable. They said that in their article, that there will be dangers with the current standards, and that these animals, these bees, on which agriculture depends, could be imperiled. Now, we know there are many things affecting bees right now, including neonicotinoid pesticides and other pesticides. So it's not like one size fits all. That's part of what makes environmental studies so challenging. But I will tell you right now that if we go ahead with the proliferation that is being planned in some areas, we are going to endanger our pollinating insects. And that's not a risk that I think should be taken. I think one of the things that's missing from this reply is any consideration of the impact on space. And I know that our colleagues, Jillian Gresser and Joe Sandry and others, are making a very strong argument for why the launching of 40,000 satellites at this point would be detrimental to space exploration, detrimental to predicting hurricanes, and interfering with marine navigation. Now, it would seem to me that when you've got experts from NASA and NOAA writing to the FCC, asking them to rethink their plans with respect to this, that should be taken seriously. And that's just not even addressed as an issue. In the electromagnetic radiation network of the group from New England I was referring to before, when they sued in 2003, they argued that the FCC had failed to rely on outside experts in its analysis. And the court ruled that the FCC was within its limits to do that. But now, it's not 2003, it's 2020. It's 17 years later. And you know what? Other federal governments have actually tasked their expert scientists with reviewing the science and have come up with very, very different conclusions, which is why you can look at our website, ehtrust.org, and you will find all the evolution of what has been happening in France and some of what has happened in the past in Israel. We think that the arguments to uphold our position are quite strong, that the failure to protect children can't even be debated. They don't even debate it. They simply talk about the head of an adult versus a child and not the brain. That fails utterly to understand the most basic parts that we know about developmental neurology, and that the current limits fail to take into account the fact that children are often using these devices with arms that are too short. In other words, a laptop is tested 8 inches off of this large adult male body. And how many times do we give a little kid something and they hold it directly on their body? We really, really should not do that. Any device that a child uses should be plugged in, wired, if at all possible, disconnected from Wi-Fi if they have to look at something, and always on a table and never on the body. I mentioned before the assertion they make that the phones are tested at 0 distance from the head, and they're not. They're ignoring their own ruling. They issued a PINA and said what they were doing. At this point, I'd like to just mention two new publications that, one of which I think is particularly relevant. And I wondered if I could share something that I'm working on right now. I think the one that is available somewhere on our website, right, is an analysis showing that the risk of colon and rectal cancer in people born recently who are under the age of 40 is much, much higher, up to 4 times higher than for people who were born in the 1940s. Now, why would you have a 4-fold increase in a very rare disease? Rectal cancer is not supposed to happen in people in their 30s. And it's happening more and more for people in their 30s and 40s. So much so that they changed the age for screening. But this isn't about screening, in our opinion. There are a number of interesting experimental studies that indicate that the colon is especially sensitive to radiofrequency radiation. And some of them have been done by a group of scientists in Iran at the Ionizing and Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection Research Center of Shiraz University. Now, whatever our issues with Iran, they have, like a lot of other countries, including Turkey and Israel, they have an institute that's devoted to looking at ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. The French have the same. This institute actually conducted experimental work where they took colorectal cells, which you can culture, and they exposed them to radiofrequency radiation levels that would be consistent with what we could get from current phones, not 5G, just current phones, 3G and 4G. And they looked at certain proteins in those cells that are known to be predictive of cancer, hypermethylated proteins. And they found that after exposure to ionizing radiation, there was a certain pattern of increased risk, ionizing, but they found the same pattern after non-ionizing. In other words, yes, we know that X-rays, ionizing radiation, are damaging. Nobody debates that. For years, the FCC has said, well, this is non-ionizing. This study, damaging effects from non-ionizing radiation you can get from cell phones. That's what this study showed. So in our article, we show that work, and then I'm going to try to show this. And if you look at the bottom, these two figures here on the are the birth cohorts for colon on the left and rectum on the right. Okay? And look at the bottom where this is going up. This is the youngest people. The trend is going up for the youngest and down for the oldest. Now, next time you see a young person with their tights and their phone slipped right in there, you might want to tell them to look at our website. You might want to tell them to think about the exposure. And the fact is, phones are tested off the body. They are tested up to 1 inch off the body. That's what the FCC says. And yet phones are being used directly on the body. So there's other work that's consistent with this.
Even if phones are at a distance, you're still receiving the pulses of wireless radiation. So even if you're compliant with FCC limits, you're not protected. But what is so egregious is that even if we thought that those limits were protective, when you use the devices like you normally would, like people do all the time, putting them in their pocket, resting them on their abdomen. I saw someone sit on their phone the other day just to keep it in a good place while they were staying seated, that those positions you can exceed FCC allowable limits. And the FCC has promoted, certainly in the past, and you'll hear from industry, oh, there's a 50-time safety factor. Well, there is no 50-time safety factor, even if we believe the regulations, especially when it comes to the devices themselves. This is a piece of misinformation that is promoted by industry. I'm going to find a link to the paper and put it up as well, Dr. Davis.
Yes, I think that would be good. And then the last thing I wanted to share before I have to go, and sorry for the interruption there, involves something I'm thinking of writing, and I would welcome, I'd like to read part of it, and I would welcome feedback from the Patreon members of what they think we should include or change. This is being written for a major international publication because it seems to be more challenging to get it into the US press. I start out explaining that recently Daimler Chrysler has paid $2 billion in fines to the federal government and the state of California because they sold over $250 million diesel engines that emitted diesel exhaust 40 times more dangerous than standards allowed. How did they do that? Well, they did it because they created a rigged test system so that whenever the car sensed it was hooked up to a test computer, it would not emit dangerous pollutants. But on the real road, it did. Think about this when you look at those dreadful fires and those orange skies in San Francisco. Some part of that is diesel exhaust that was making it much worse than it would have because there were 250,000 cars, many of them in California, on the road with these diesel engines. So another industry may soon find itself in financial and regulatory crosshairs for selling products that rely on bogus test system. And you can guess which one that is. The global multi-trillion-dollar telecom business of smartphones and tablets depends utterly on 24-year-old radiation exposure test systems that have never been evaluated for health or environmental impacts. Microwave radiation from phones is evaluated assuming that the device is kept up to an inch off the body, and the only effect to be avoided is that of heating. Radiation from laptops, still being used by millions of young school kids, is tested at about 8 inches from a large adult male body. Well, we talked before about the Tribune test. In response, the FCC yesterday affirmed that its outdated test system remains valid and that heat is the only effective concern. It also alleged that no scientific information, no new scientific information had been obtained to justify taking any changes. Well, there's something wrong with this picture. First of all, for the past 2 decades, telecom firms have operated without insurance. They can't get insurance for their operations. Secondary insurance, like Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re, that provide backup for business, have refused to cover health or environmental damages for mobile phones and other devices for 2 decades. And just last year, before COVID-19, Swiss Re, a multi-billion-dollar secondary insurance firm, issued a report, and it termed the untested 5G technology off the leash, the same category as mad cow disease, asbestos, and other previously unpredictable risks. Business liability is a big deal here because many, many firms are requiring their employees to be using phones, and the Italian Supreme Court has ruled in favor of a worker who developed a tumor in his head because his job required him to use a mobile phone. And in that ruling, the Supreme Court of Italy said that there was little evidence of harm in the industry-funded studies, in contrast to findings of harm in independent studies, and therefore gave more weight to the independent studies, such as those that we've done with our colleagues in Brazil, Alvaro de Salas and Claudio Fernandez, in Canada with Professor Anthony B. Miller and others. The government of France, as some of you know, has conducted independent measurements of phone radiation for years. The French Standards Authority, we don't really have anything quite like it, found that 400 models of cell phones exceeded the standard for exposure by 3 to 5 times the limit of the French, which is in fact a higher limit than we have. They allow more radiation in their phones. Marc Arazi, a physician who founded PhoneGate Alert, has pressed the French government, and they have continued to recall phones for exceeding radiation limits. Sometimes the recall only requires a software upgrade to reduce emissions. And similar recommendations have been issued by other governments in high-tech countries, Israel, Belgium, France. Where is the United States in all of this? You know, this is one planet, and the standards for phones that we set influence the entire system. Further, of course, the FCC has the gall to reject the NTP study, which it commissioned and oversaw and designed and approved every step along the way. This $30 million study, was approved by the FDA officials who are no longer there. Interestingly, the new people who are in charge were very new to this issue, as is apparent by some of the statements that they've made. Although drug development at the FDA depends on the use of animal studies to predict human impacts, as we're seeing all the time. When it comes to environmental predictions, the FDA dismisses the very study it had once requested, designed, and approved. So I want to talk about a new study that's quite technical, but I think very important for what we're trying to communicate. And that is a study done by David Gultigan and experts in electrical engineering, including a life fellow of the IEEE. And this study looked at a fresh cow brain that was perfused with fluid and tested it with 6 minutes of pulsed exposure to a beam-forming component of 5G at 39 gigahertz. Now that's a lot, that's a high frequency. That is a currently approved frequency for 5G, right? And they showed that just 6 minutes of pulsed exposure could increase temperatures inside the cow brain, which they measured, up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 centigrade. This result is, I think, astonishing and important. It is, however, a higher frequency band and a different mechanism that's involved. And the point is that the Department of Defense already has an active denial system, a long-range acoustic device that relies on this higher frequency band and a different mechanism to make the skin feel like it's a fire. And some federal officials actually proposed using this to clear the White House Plaza last month rather than the tear gas that they ended up using. Well, we don't know. That's the whole point. We are flying blind. We do not have adequate information. We cannot now estimate how much of our dirty urban skies today is due to these polluting diesel engines. We don't know. But we can be certain that these flawed defeater devices constitute a major contributor to dirty European vistas where the same engines were sold as well. And despite repeated promises by the FCC over many years that we're going to study the problem, the fact is the US government today has almost no research underway at all on the biological effects of any of these forms of radiation, except for classified studies carried out in the military. We know that there's a lot of activity that's going on here that's involved in international issues. And even with respect to China, there is a real important argument to be had about whether control of 5G can be achieved or whether open 5G may actually create more freedom and more free markets. I don't have a position on that. But I do know this. The question is not no 5G or yes 5G, but how can safer systems be made that address the essential needs for communication and also lessen their public health and environmental impacts. And I would welcome any comments on this. It's a draft. I've just kind of gone over parts of it and would appreciate hearing from you with any thoughts you might have, including you, Ms. Scurato.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with everyone. Actually, is really honored to be here while you read some of your writing. You've published so much, and we have all of that on EHT if you're interested in more of those op-eds that Dr. Davis has written. So I think this is really timely and really important. I continue to just be really speechless that 5G is being put ahead without proper safeguards in place to ensure that the technology is safe.
Well, actually, I think we would be remiss not to mention the International Stop 5G Day that is coming up, right, in 2 days. That Kate Keel and Doug and Patty Wood, and please make sure we give a shout out to all the people who've been working on this all over the world, because ironically, the United States like with climate, is going to have to follow other countries rather than lead.
You know, one of the, I'll put a link in the chat to the International Stop 5G Day, but it's
Please.
really important that everyone be advocating to their officials at every level of government about the lack of accountability at the top, at the federal level.
Well, there's a question here from Hal Bin Chai. Why do we think the FCC has not taken our request seriously? What are our chances for appeal? All right. Well, obviously, we have very strong chances of succeeding in this appeal because the FCC, in its arrogance, has acted like a supra-constitutional agency that does not need to comply with existing federal law. They have asserted they don't need to apply with NEPA. They don't need to apply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's no justification for that in the law. They've said they don't have to apply with the Administrative Procedures Act. These acts, this Administrative Procedures Act, has guided the federal government's performance for decades. And the FCC never took seriously the need to provide a rational and systematic record of review of the comments that were received. And further, in the mess of the websites of the data system that they established, which we can establish in our record, this is evidence per se of their failure to take the Administrative Procedure Act seriously. If they were serious, they would have hired a consultant, they would have done the analysis, they would have had a systematic review of all of the material submitted. Instead, what they did is they cherry-picked, went to the FDA, that did a selective review only on cancer, ignored all the evidence on damage to sperm, effects on children's memory and spatial recognition, sleep disturbances, which can be very grave. They ignored all of that and simply had a cherry-picked report on some of the studies on cancer that said there's no problem. Now, I think that the courts are our best hope, and we will make headway with this lawsuit.
We will.
The grounds for this appeal are so compelling that we have a number of very, very smart lawyers working on this, and we have little doubt that we will succeed. But even after we succeed, everybody on this call has got to bring 10 more people in and make sure people understand that we're not anti-technology, we're pro-health. And we think the American public has a right to know more than it does know about this technology and to take steps to protect themselves accordingly.
Take the time, if you're really interested in this, to read the briefs, the amicus briefs that were filed, because they provide incredibly important information. NRDC talks about how the EPA was defunded from actually doing research on this issue. So the FCC is saying, well, our limits don't need to be changed, but yet there is actually no health and safety agency that is researching to understand the effects in terms of insects, trees, plants, etc. And so how can you say that something is fine when there's actually no health and safety agency that has been looking into that? And included in the NRDC brief is a letter that was written to me by the director of air and radiation at the EPA, where the director states that they have no funded mandate and that the last review they did on biological effects was in the 1984. So, the facts are pretty clear. The challenge, I think, is going to be that the FCC and their industry information that's been cited, of which there is much industry-funded information cited in that brief, can be confusing. And we're really hopeful that the court will take the time to understand this issue and cut through the misinformation that's been presented.
And that's where we need your help, because we know what the major issues are, but of course we get just a limited number of words to reply, and we have to do a better job of communicating the fact that other experts in other countries have looked at newer data and have decided, in the case of France, they've issued a ruling in July of this year that took effect, which is on our website, which says to avoid exposure to the abdomens of teenagers. If that were made more publicly known, we might be sparing these young people the rectal cancers that are increasing now. We might. Now, look, I want to be clear. In the paper on rectal cancer, we say there are many different factors that can cause this: obesity, diabetes, lack of exercise. But one of them is also exposure to radiation from phones in the pocket and CAT scans, because this is the generation that as children may have had a lot of CAT scans, more so than others. And that's a lot of radiation. So we don't know which of these things explains it, but we know there's something that needs an explanation, because when a rate of cancer changes 4 to 5 times in 2 decades, that is not because of genetics. That is a signal that there are environmental factors that are relevant. That's why we have to pay attention. And the other thing you were mentioning about the insects, the FCC says, oh, that study from the Department of Interior was worried just about birds colliding with antennas. No, that's not true. And we will cite the study and we will say, no, it's about nesting patterns. It's about reproduction. It's about navigation. It's about the cryptochrome. The cryptochrome, crypto meaning hidden, chrome meaning color, is a protein behind the eye of every migrating animal. Birds, bees, fruit flies, buffalo, they all have a cryptochrome. And the cryptochrome senses the Earth's magnetic field. That's how hummingbirds fly thousands of miles. They don't stop in the middle and take a sight reading. They sense the Earth's magnetic field. We don't fully understand it. It's recently been in science, there's research on it right now. But cryptochromes are damaged and can be interfered with by radio frequency radiation.
And yeah, and I would just want to add, in terms of what other countries are doing, India looked at the research on insects, bees, and birds, and they dropped their allowable limits, the ambient from the cell towers, to 1/10 of what they were before. After reviewing the data and finding the most of the studies showed effects, and as well, Switzerland has much lower allowable levels of radio frequency from antennas. And they did a very large review with a lot of experts and actually could not agree, as normally happens on these commissions. And they ended up proposing 3 different options. One was to increase the allowable radiation to allow 5G easier. The second was to keep things the same. And the third was to reduce and mitigate exposures even more, and ultimately decided to keep the levels as they were. However, when Parliament decided not to allow increasing the levels, that means Switzerland has allowable levels much lower than in the United States and many countries, and lower than ICNIRP or FCC limits. So many countries are doing different things. Actually, there's several countries that allow less radiation or have policies promoting less exposures near schools, near homes, not allowing cell towers near schools and homes. And it's all on our site at Environmental Health Trust if you're interested in that as well.
And there will be information on our social media about the efforts around the world to stop 5G. We are more involved in the research and policy, but we're delighted and really honored to be able to work with people like Kate Keel and Doug and Patty Wood and others that have been really instrumental in providing for a broader public understanding of the issues. I think that one of the things you might want to talk about that we haven't addressed is the fact that they rely on ICNIRP. And this is a minority, self-controlled, self-appointed, self-monitored private group that reports to nobody and nothing, that has a history of years of being funded directly or indirectly by industry. Its total budget doesn't account for all its activities, and so there's something, there that needs to be further pursued. But it is the authority upon which the U.S. government is relying. Now think about this. We all pay taxes, and we're relying on a private group to tell us what our standards should be for phone radiation. I think that that's unconscionable. I think there ought to be an independent National Academy of Engineering and Medicine group that would look at the data and make recommendations. That's never been done. The closest we came was in 2008, or when an Institute of Medicine had a workshop on the issue of radio frequency radiation, and they had the majority of the people in the workshop were international. Why? Because they had almost no US experts they could get. So whenever you hear the FCC say, we're relying on studies from the US government, show me, where is it? Because the only study from the US government is the one they commissioned from the MTP. And that study not only showed an increase in cancer, but also showed subsequently increased DNA damage. Now, DNA damage isn't necessarily mean you're going to get cancer, but it often happens with it. And so to ignore this science from the government's flagship testing program, because a bunch of people were brought in to spin the science. And so what we have to deal with here is the fact that, as the Harvard University Center for Ethics pointed out in 2014, I believe, the FCC is a captured agency. That is the conclusion of a Harvard University investigation of support for the FCC. By that, they mean the current heads of the FCC come from industry and will go back to industry. And that revolving door has existed since the 1990s. So it's not a Republican or a Democratic thing. It's all of them. This industry has done a superb job of capturing the flag. Now the question is, are they going to run with it and do the right thing and make the changes that need to be made to make this technology safer? That's what we want. We want the technology to be made safer. And we know that there are ways to do it because patents are held by Nokia, among others, for how to reduce radiation. And this can and should be done.
Thank you so much. I'll also point out, related to ICNIRP, the amicus brief of Joe Selendry had a declaration by Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who is the former director of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. And she talks about the NTP study, which you're referring to, and specifically addresses that ICNIRP and a paper done by Dr. Melnick that talks about that the criticisms of the NTP study are actually unfounded. And some of those unfounded criticisms that ICNIRP put forward are interestingly put forward by the FCC in their brief. It's quite shocking, but if you're not technically understanding all of this issue, it's very easy to just not understand that. But if you look at the FCC brief, it's filled with every piece of misinformation that we've seen for decades on this issue.
Well, in fairness to the FCC lawyers, they're not scientists, not biologists, and it shows in what they've written. Now, that's going to be a problem for all lawyers, okay? That's a fundamental challenge for democracy. How do judges make decisions when there's complex science? Some people have suggested science courts. We kind of are on the verge of that now, but it's a challenge, okay? And you're absolutely right. The FCC is mastered the ability to confuse people. And they are themselves confused. I don't doubt that they are. And in the past, I was often invited in to brief the FCC. I haven't been invited in for some time.
Well,
and
thank you so much.
Right. Okay.
And we appreciate your support. It is making a huge difference. Please spread the word. Tell your community. Please continue to support Environmental Health Trust and educate others about this issue so that we can make the meaningful policy changes that are needed when it comes to technology.
And Happy New Year. And Gamar Chatima Tova to those of you who will, like me, be fasting on Yom Kippur.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.